So why learn the zone system? Well, there are many good reasons, but consistent exposure tops the list. The camera is designed to give a good exposure under average conditions with average subject matter. But when your subject is too dark or too light, the camera is likely to give you a poor exposure. Difficult situations such as high contrast found in architectural photography will also trouble your camera. And backlit scenes are notorious for throwing off the camera's meterings. Coming up with a standard approach will help ensure that we are never at a loss for knowing what to do in any situation. In addition to consistently getting good exposures, you also want to get good photographs. A correct exposure does not always make a compelling image. Using the zone system enables you to analyze the quality of light. Stepping into this cedar grove, I knew I wanted to portray the highlights as crisp and clean with sharp detail. But because most of the scene consisted of dark areas, I also had to be very careful to hold shadow detail as well. This is an image that I would have never taken unless I'd metered first. It is an unusual situation in that both the cliffs and the tree are not complete silhouettes, a common occurrence when looking right into the sun. The reason is that there's a large wall of rock behind me that is bouncing light back into the scene. This saves the composition. After metering, I realized that the light was unique and became very excited about making the photograph. Evening light on Mount Shasta. In this image, both the shadows and highlights were very important. In the print, you can see the delicate ridge lines and sculpted snow. If the entire top of the mountain was without detail, the image would not have the same impact. Conversely, if the shadow area in the center of the image was solid black, it would create a large hole in the image. This in turn would take you away from exploring the top and the bottom of the scene. The slot canyons of Arizona and Utah are an amazing place to study light. The rock formations are otherworldly, but sometimes the light is too contrasty and other times it's pretty flat. In this situation, the light was just right. I began by metering the most important part of the scene, this intense color right in the center. After metering, I was happy to note that the highlights in here were not going to blow out, and the shadows were going to retain detail. Sometimes it's just as important to know when not to take a photograph as when to take it. Perfect example, Bellagio fountains. When finding the average tone, you'll quickly find that your highlights will blow out. A better option would be to wait for the fountains to change their shape. This way the highlights will become a little bit less intense. Or this mountain scene. It was a partially cloudy day, and at the moment that I composed this image, the whole foreground was behind the shade of a cloud. It looks much better like this when the sun comes back out again. So you're analyzing, what is the light looking like at the moment? Can it change? Will it change? Will it look better when it does change? In this image, a cemetery in southern Georgia, I was really compelled by the shapes of the trees and the brightness and the tombstone. But after I snapped the shot, I noticed that, well, the sky is too bright, and even though there's detail within the tombstone itself, it's really not that exciting of an image. It would have been much better had it been a softer light without all of these harsh highlights and deep shadows and bright highlights. Another nice thing about metering your scene before you start is to know when you need to use flash. In this brick hallway, I was noting that the light and the motion through here was just beautiful, but it was very deep black where I was standing, and I realized after I metered that this was all going to become solid black. So put on a little on-camera flash, and you're able to make a much better exposure. Similar thing in this situation. Metering outside here, I knew the highlights would all come into play and have nice detail, but when metering in the shadows, they became pure black. So put on an on-camera flash, set it at -1, and just throw a little bit of fill light in to make it look a little bit more natural. Determine when and how to use split neutral density filters. This is imperative for the landscape photographer. Well, when you're shooting at sunset or sunrise, the sky is so much brighter than the foreground. You make an exposure for the sky, and the foreground is pure black. make an exposure for the foreground and the sky is blown out. So what you need to do is you figure out how much difference there is between the top and bottom, and then put on a split neutral density filter to bring the light back together. Digital imaging has allowed us to make images that were impossible not that long ago. For example, we can now bracket exposures of the same scene and blend them together to create an image that is very close to reality. A single exposure can only capture a limited range of tones. In this shot, we can readily see detail in the stained glass, but the entire church is completely black. So we need to make a few more exposures. Once all the proper exposures are made, we can use tools such as Photoshop's Merge to HDR function to seamlessly blend the exposures together to create what we actually saw in the first place. By now you're realizing that your camera is likely to underexpose or overexpose your photographs. So, the question we need to ask is, why? Well, it usually has to do with subject matter or light. And your camera is designed to give you good exposures under average situations. That means average subject matter, average light. So, when faced with difficult or uncommon situations, it's going to fail, as it did in this photograph. Here it saw too much of this dark value below, and it overexposed the top of my scene. But by metering up here and getting the correct exposure, the color is much more brilliant. And we now realize that the bottom is too dark, so we can crop in a little bit when we zoom in on our camera. So before we've even taken the shot, we can get a better exposure and a better composition. Similar here, the shot almost looks like it was made at night, but it was the middle of the day. The sky was very overcast, which means it's quite bright in comparison to the subjects on the ground. And when pointing right up into it, the camera has underexposed it. This is an uncommon scene. And your camera wants to see average tones. Well, what it's seeing is a whole lot of bright values here. So it's going to underexpose the dark values. By reevaluating and taking your own meter reading, you get a much better exposure of both the bottom and the top. Here in this morning fog shot in California, the camera is seeing an enormous amount of bright white filtering through the fog, and it underexposed the scene. But by taking our own meter readings, we create a much more compelling and interesting image. Here my camera was fooled into overexposure because 2/3 of the scene is comprised of very dark rock. By taking several meter readings, I was able to determine a more realistic exposure. So we see that when confronted with these types of unaveraged scenes or unaveraged light, our camera will often fail us. But rather than walk away from these interesting images, we will learn how to use the zone system to expose them properly, or to calculate exposures for an efficient bracketing sequence, or perhaps even to determine which filter to choose to create a more realistic image. So in the next section, we'll begin by looking at how our camera's meter operates and how it determines exposure.